think some of this unlearning around perfectionism does require, again, some like external validation that it is okay, right? And like not having the bad, terrible things happen when we aren't kind of operating at 110%, so that then we can start to give ourselves grace.
Hello, and welcome to Working Your Way, the podcast dedicated to exploring the journey of authenticity in the workplace and discovering how to navigate it your way. I'm your host, Sandhya Sudhakar, and this episode is part of a series called Let's Talk About Labels, where we discuss the labels that we have a love-hate relationship with and break down what they really mean for each of us. Now, as always, we'll also share some ways that you can reflect on how they show up in your own life and career. And for this series, I'm inviting my friends to weigh in and share their experience using one of my very favorite ways to communicate, the voice note. I'm bringing on a co-host for this series as well. She's my friend and fellow entrepreneur, Arden Evenson. She's a content creator who advocates for financial inclusion. And when she's not talking about making money, she's talking about making babies, sharing all about her fertility journey online. In these episodes, we're really going to cover it all, from diving into the depths of human behavior to sharing our hopefully hilarious hot takes. So without further ado, let's get into the episode. All right, we are back with another episode of Let's Talk About Labels. And today we're going to talk about being a perfectionist.
I definitely consider myself. I know. I think I'm a recovering perfectionist. I feel like it's one of those labels I'm doing better and better about letting go of every day. But I'm sure as we dig into people's voice notes today and listen in that there is a lot that I'm going to relate to.
Yeah, I love it. Okay, so let's define perfectionism. And so in my very limited research, what I found is that it says a perfectionist is a person who strives for flawlessness. A person who strives for flawlessness and sets excessively high performance standards for themselves, often leading to stress and dissatisfaction.
Correct.
Perfectionism involves setting unrealistically high standards, being overly critical of oneself when those standards are not met. And it's associated with all or nothing thinking, kind of black and white, all in or not okay. And some of the behaviors that people who would consider themselves perfectionists might display. One is procrastination, delaying maybe starting the tasks because they fear they won't do them perfectly, overworking, spending tons and tons of time, right? Just like trying to make everything perfect and overworking yourself, or suffering from a fear of failure, which I know can certainly like lead to the procrastination, but also can just lead to a lot of anxiety and unnecessary energy expended.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, immediately I think about like I've worked for myself off and on for probably most of my career at this point, for like over a decade. And I think for whatever reason, it's very interesting. I think maybe because the scope of work is a lot more clear and the boundaries are more firm, but I don't know, I'm able to like a little bit let go almost of that perfectionism more as a consultant. I obsess over it a little bit less, I think, because I tell myself there's like no way of knowing exactly what this client wants. And so I shouldn't make assumptions on what perfect is to them. And so instead of painstakingly trying getting it to 100%, I can just send them the thing at 90%, get their reactions, and then we can actually get to something that looks like they're 100%. And so I think as I've been in this kind of recovering perfectionist vibe, I feel like the shift to working for myself has actually allowed me to sort of shed a little bit of those tendencies in my work.
I think it's interesting because in a way, working for yourself is like the most personal thing that you can do, right? Your work becomes so personal. And when you're doing client work, it's their stuff. So it's almost like on one hand, you could take it super personally, or it gives you a way to detach from the outcomes a little bit. And so I think I'm hearing a little bit more of the second in what you're saying.
Yeah. And I think like because also I have I have multiple clients, that there is a little bit of the like, I mean, what are they going to do? Fire me? Like, I could replace them as a client. I have other people to do work for. It's not, you and I have talked a lot about like kind of psychological safety. And I think like job security can certainly be a part of that.
Yeah.
And I think that my mindset around that is a little bit different as a consultant versus when I'm like full time in a place. It feels less stable to me, which is weird because I know that's not how most people think about kind of consulting and freelance work, but I feel more stable as a consultant.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think this may be a little bit of a tangent, but I've noticed that I actually feel more control over my job working for myself, which is true. I can't get laid off. I won't lay myself off, so I know that's not going to happen. However, it definitely does bring up some really high stakes standards. It feels like for me in terms of like how I show up and how people see the work that I put out into the world. So I think we'll talk a little bit more about that, but should we jump into a voice note?
Yeah, let's do it.
I have a feeling we're going to definitely be talking about that lovely thing called the inner critic here in a little bit. So, okay, let's listen to the first one.
For me, perfectionism showed up in trying to record this voice note about perfectionism, which that is that I tried to get it right. I tried to get it to sound exactly how I wanted everybody to perceive me, as smart, intelligent, alive, all of the things, as needing to get my points across succinctly, instead of just allowing myself to flow and be messy and show the not so great parts and be freaking human. God forbid I sound human in my note about perfectionism. But what it prevents me from doing is actually focusing on the impact that I want to make, the difference that I so deeply yearn for, the aliveness that I want to spark, the transformation that I want to make. I'm spending all of my time trying to get it so perfect, so right, so whatever, so perceived a certain way that I lose sight of what's actually truly important.
That was lovely.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I mean, I think connected to this for me is, I really identified a lot as an overachiever, kind of growing up, especially academically. And that's what, that's like kind of tied to success and, tied to like, yeah, it's like achievement is the goal. And that's, as you know, something I'm doing really good at shedding as I aspire to work as little as possible now. But it's weird to have spent all of your life like pursuing this very like shit like this. They're all pretty perfect goals, right? Like getting really good scores on those AP exams and like writing the college essay that's going to get you in and doing well on SAT tests. And all of these things are pretty regimental, pretty rigid in terms of how we're judging kind of quality and success. And a lot of it isn't human, right? And I think, as I've been working on sort of letting go of some of these kind of perfectionist tendencies, some of this like achievement sort of soul focus, that it's about giving more room to like be a human and connecting and like focusing more on that personality. And even in my writing, it's like letting go of grammar rules. Let's get over ourselves and like writing something that feels like a person actually wrote it and not, an AI robot.
Yeah, I think, I mean, what you're talking about there, I hear the high standards, right? It's
Yeah.
everything has to be done to a T. Also the overworking of like my high standard for myself and like what I achieve leads me to work too much or,
Yeah.
we're reformed perfectionists now. Yes, for those listening, Arden and I actually bond over how much we love sleep. I think that's
I love
like a
sleep.
key pillar of our friendship.
Ugh.
And with that, it's a lot of it is like, how can I make a bigger impact with less hours? And
Yeah.
how can I do work that I really love and that helps people a lot? But I never started a business to work 80 hours a week. I mean, that was
No.
never, I started a business actually to be able to have more flexibility and freedom. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Same.
so in the voice note, what I heard was actually something I relate to really strongly, which is like this need to show up perfectly. And so that's not oh, my grammar, the grammar's perfect, or this analysis that I did is amazing, or I hit my sales goal times 2, like not that kind of standard. It's more of I have always prided myself on being really independent and being very capable and resourceful.
Ugh. Yep.
And so the idea of like needing to show up perfectly, needing to show up like I always have it all together is kind of my version of perfectionism. And I think when it comes to my image, and I don't necessarily mean like how I physically look all the time, but it's like my professional image or those types of things, I find myself being very perfectionistic about that.
Yeah, I can like really relate. As someone has like once labeled me as like hyper competent. And
Yeah.
that's such a broad compliment,
Yeah.
right? And so
Yeah.
it like I feel like I need to be hyper competent in everything. And that's like a skill, and it is a skill. Like it is a skill I bring to the table. It's like why clients can trust me to project manage something and not just write a good blog post for them, because I can figure this stuff out. But yeah, it does put me in a position. It's very rare. We in my kind of group in Brooklyn, we really will remind ourselves that you're not driving this social interaction right now, or like you don't have to make all of the decisions. You are not the lead. You are not in the spotlight tonight. You could just attend and just like have a nice time. But like we really do have to remind ourselves to that, because again, we're just like very used to like showing up and yeah, being responsible and like taking charge of things. And yeah, I can really relate to that.
Yeah, it reminds me of there was a job that I really, really wanted. It was like a next role at a big company. And somebody I'd worked with before kind of put in a like letter of recommendation, an informal letter of recommendation. They sent an email to the hiring manager for this particular role, who the hiring manager didn't know me really well. But what he wrote in that email, because I think he sent it to me, or the boss when I got the job sent it to me, it said something like, she's the kind of person that no matter what, she will figure it out. She always gets it done. And I was so proud of that, because it is something that I hold like so dear, that like I will always figure it out. I'll find a way to make something happen, right? And that's the hyper confidence, and it's also like the worst.
Yeah. Well, it's like we set ourselves up. I think it's just like we are kind of setting ourselves up for failure, right? And that we have to keep meeting this like excessively high standards. And I think you see this especially maybe with people that are starting new jobs, right? You just like really want to like show that you belong, show that you deserve to be there, make sure that you're going to get to stick around. And so you say yes to everything, you overwork to make sure that you're producing this like 110% quality work. And then 6 months in, you realize you can't keep up with it. Right. And like, but that's what now people think that you're capable of, because they probably don't realize that you're overworking to achieve kind of that level. And it's really hard to reset.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let's listen to the second one. I have some other things that have come up, but we'll wait.
I feel like I've been labeled a perfectionist by people in my life, primarily my family. And really, I think what they meant by that is that I had my own way of doing things, and that way had to be perfect in my mind. And as I reflect on that as a grown-up, I think it means that I have, high standards and a strong sense of value. It's important to me that I make the most of the opportunities that come my way, whether that's, maximizing my time while I'm on a work trip or getting all my emails replied to by the end of the week. I hold myself to a really high standard because I feel like I only have one life and I would hate to waste a second of it.
It's so interesting because it like almost feels like a little bit of a conflict in, you know, doing things a certain way, but also like doing it in order to experience life. And I wonder if some of that is like, if I respond to all my emails by the end of the week, then I can like feel free on the weekend, or I can like, you know, have the peace of mind to like be present in other things too.
Yeah. And this idea of like their family labeling them like in this way as like,
Yeah.
yeah, almost. Because I feel like most of the time, well, I would say growing up, being labeled a perfectionist was like more a compliment than not. Right. It was like, again, it was like great that you had these really high standards. It's great that you were being so careful and putting so much effort into this and like getting your A's. Like, that's the goal. You should be doing that. And like the way that I'm hearing this voice note is that like it's almost the family's reaction of like being like, oh, this is a different way of doing things. Right. And that like they sound like they have a really strong like sense of self and like what their values are, and it's less driven by external like views of perfectionism and more kind of by their own sort of standards, which I think is so interesting because I feel like my perfectionism is, while I feel like self-motivated, I've always been a very self-motivated individual. I think I am reacting very much to external stimuli in terms of what I'm trying to do properly.
Yeah, I think the idea of the family labeling, there's other people, anyone else labeling you anything, right, can feel a little like intrusive. And I almost feel like it could be, not saying it is in this voice note, right? But like, I think if someone were to say you're such a perfectionist, there could be a negative connotation of that, of like, oh, you're like controlling, or, you know, like you're
right, like a try hard or something, like you think you're better than other people.
Oh, totally. That, and or you need to have things done a certain way. And that's like making that like a negative thing, you know, which, to be fair, sometimes maybe it is, right? But
Yeah, but I love this. It's just so interesting to hear their experience of this term, because I think, you know, we've previously talked about people pleasing, and I could see in myself a lot of overlap in those labels internally. And I think this is just a really interesting example of how they don't have to be the same thing, right? Like those labels don't have to be as close Venn diagrams, as snugly Venn diagrams as mine are.
yeah, they're not a circle. What you said about perfectionism being a compliment is interesting, because you remember that like old interview question of like, what's your biggest flaw?
Oh my God.
And like, there was a whole decade, maybe two, where the answer to that question was, I'm just too much of a perfectionist. I like need to, you know, my standards are so high, right? And so we actually like have this positive cultural definition of being a perfectionist, even though that was like, let's be honest, it was a total bullshit answer, right? Like it's like the answer that you give when you don't want to actually say what you're not good at.
Right.
But the idea that like, oh, I'm going to say it's a bad thing, but like, you're going to know that I have really high standards at the end of the day. Like, you know, it's like such a funny thing.
Yeah, it is. It does feel that like only, I don't know, I feel like the pandemic of it all was such a big like transition period, I think, for a lot of us, and how we think about ourselves, how we think about our relationship with work and other people. And yeah, realizing like how some of these labels and the behaviors associated with them like serve us, and when they don't.
Yeah. It's so true. And I think, I don't know when it was, at some point, that stupid interview question went away, which is great.
Yeah.
Setting yourself up to get a fake answer from someone.
Right.
Okay. Let's listen to the next one.
I would definitely call myself a perfectionist. Well, a recovering perfectionist. I think when first of all, it's so subjective, you know, what is perfect. So you're holding yourself to this unrealistic standard. And what's really sad about it is, sure, you know, you come across as hardworking and into the details, and people love that. But ultimately, like, along the way, you never learn how to actually appreciate your work, or just be proud of yourself or your accomplishments. It's like sort of what's next. And if you ever find yourself as a perfectionist managing others or managing a team, let me tell you, this can really, it has a chilling effect on everyone else because, some might think, oh, I can't live up to your standards, but others are like, you are unrealistic and you're micromanaging and you're not letting me learn. And so it wasn't really until I became a manager of other people that I noticed just how harmful this perfectionism was. And I'd also say sort of now that I'm older and have really sort of worked on that in the workplace, in my life, I realized that being a perfectionist means I compromise self-compassion. Like you can't have self-compassion or grace for yourself or understand yourself or really truly love yourself if you are just constantly seeking perfectionism, right? And that's been a big learning for me.
Oh my gosh, there's so much
Yeah.
that came up in that.
Yeah, I mean, first just touching on kind of this idea of grace that I saw this. I've been thinking a lot about this like kind of beautiful example I saw recently, kind of pushing back, I think, on perfectionism. I partnered with a couple of other consultants to pitch a really big branding project down in North Carolina, where I'm from, actually. And so I flew down there. We were meeting that morning and getting ready. And one of the other consultants had just like not slept well the night before. And she was like really, honest about that and was like, I'm doing my best, blah, blah, blah. And at one point she's like, oh my God, I forgot the Post-it notes. I don't have the Post-it notes. I didn't have them with me. And the other woman looks at her and goes, hey, give yourself some grace today. And I was just like, oh, like I think that like for us to, I think some of this unlearning around perfectionism does require, again, some like external validation that it is okay, right? And like not having the bad, terrible things happen when we aren't kind of operating at 110%, so that then we can start to give ourselves grace about making mistakes or things not being perfect. So I love that sort of concept. And I think that, and connected to that is this idea of like, you can't, like, being a perfectionist holds you back from being proud of like the work that you've done. And I think that rings really true. And it's also like a real bummer.
Yeah. What it makes me think of is like the science of gratitude, right? When we can focus on like what's great about our life or be like really grateful for certain things, there's a chemical response to that. Like it has actual physiological benefits for us. And so when every time we put out some work product, we have to say, this could have been better, and this could have been better, and this could have been better, it robs us of an opportunity to, I don't know, have those positive chemicals,
Yeah.
or even just like reinforce like, hey, I'm really good at this. And like that, I think there can be a virtuous cycle in, just like with having a gratitude practice, I think there can be a virtuous cycle in focusing on what we're great at and what we've done really well, and then do more of that versus picking it apart and poking holes in it.
Yeah. And I think too, it's like, I think back to like even the kind of work that I've been attracted to. And I actually like over time, I think started stepping away from work that requires a certain level of perfection or expects a certain level of perfection. That like my husband is a software engineer. And so he codes a lot. And if you make one small like syntax error, like it's a forward slash instead of a backward slash, the whole thing gets ruined. And that just creates a rage in me, because if I miss a comma, you still kind of get what I've written and what I'm talking about.
You get the point.
Right.
Yeah.
But then in just the communication side, I really, I used to do PR work, but for the most part, PR is just like, it's just a exercise in disappointing people. And because you have no control. And if you do get something published, all you're going to hear about is the thing that went wrong, the name that's misspelled. Why is the quote this way? Why aren't they talking about us more? Not the fact that you secured this placement. And again, like as someone who thrives on words of affirmation, I was like, this work is not for me. But also there was this level of like the perfect line kept moving, right? Like it was like not really achievable and it kept moving.
That's so true. I think the idea, one of the things she was talking about in that voice note was like, if you're a perfectionist, what impact does it have on other people? And I think this one, there's both the like inner critic that happens where it's like, I'm holding myself to these really high standards and I'm not meeting them. And now I'm going to pick apart my work and feel bad about it and criticize how I could have done better. And those standards, while maybe they're not quite as high as the standards you have for yourself, can like seep onto other people, right? It can make you kind of overly critical, or she even mentioned micromanaging. And so this is one area where I think, one, we need to think about not just the impact to ourselves, but the impact to other people in doing these things. And like with people pleasing and avoiding conflict, like you're actually not serving that person, right? You're doing them a disservice by not bringing up the conflict. Whereas holding people to these high standards, holding yourself to these really high standards is doing a disservice to other people because they don't get a chance to learn. They don't get a chance to feel good about their work. They don't get a chance to actually like go and make mistakes and like have the lived experience that's going to make them better at their jobs.
Yeah, I think this is the thing that I always struggled with the most as a manager. And like a little bit of that is like kind of wanting to make everything better. But it's like, oh, well, if I know how to fix this, I'll just fix it. That's easier for everyone. If I know how to make this the way that it's supposed to be, I'll just do it. And it really takes away people's opportunities to like learn and get better and grow and experiment. And also, I might be wrong. Like my perfect idea may not be everyone else's perfect, and I shouldn't assume that I have like all the answers.
Yeah, and it could be really demotivating too for people, I think, in the sense of like they don't get a chance to feel a sense of ownership over something when it's like, oh, well, I'm going to like run it through my own filter and like change a bunch of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I'm navigating this right now a little bit with like working with like a new kind of subcontractor who's helping me write. And she's a really strong writer. I've worked with her before. But yeah, it's like finding that balance is sort of my feedback of like trying to do it the way that I know that the client wants it and get it to that next level versus like actually just communicating what the client needs that I maybe haven't communicated before, which is fine. We're just onboarding like this new relationship. But yeah, balancing my like, well, I'm just going to fix it and send it on versus like, well, how can I like make this like a more educational or constructive kind of back and forth feedback process?
Right. Making it a coaching moment where the person can take a lesson away. Or they get some new learning out of it instead of just kind of doing it for them.
Yeah.
Now, what's especially funny to me is that my editors will be listening to this podcast episode because they're my podcast editors. And they, of all people, see my perfectionist side because I am really in the details on this podcast. It's something that feels really important to me. It's something that's going to live on forever in, the digital world. And it's my image and thoughts and, my brain and my heart that I'm putting out into the world. And so I want it to represent me perfectly. And so I get in the weeds with them and they tell me that they appreciate that I'm really involved. And I'm sure sometimes it's annoying. And so it's funny because I've noticed just how perfectionistic I can be about my image or my work product through actually making this podcast.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I had a podcast for a while that you were on and like the editing, just the time spent doing that, even when I was outsourcing a lot of it. It was just like really hard for me to let go of this not being a perfect product that like if people's audio didn't sound great, I like didn't release the whole podcast if I like couldn't make it sound better. And yeah, I much prefer now like just being a guest on people's podcasts because I still get to like come and show up and chat and I love doing this. And also it's out of my hands editing. And obviously I trust you, but like I get to just do the fun part.
Yeah, totally. Totally. Yeah, it's really interesting. Okay, let's listen to the next one. And also, Sean and Charlie, you guys can laugh at me later. That's great.
A perfectionist to me is somebody who has extremely high or exacting standards for everything, and everything needs to be done really well. Of course, these are subjective terms, but perfect in their own terms. And I think that it has shown up in my life in almost every aspect. I think it has won me brownie points often at work or even from loved ones for doing things really well, but it has also meant sometimes missed opportunities for me. If I think I won't be able to do something really well, I'm even afraid to try. Or it has meant a deep disappointment when people don't show up in a similar way, whether at work or in my personal life.
What I loved about this one is it really brought to light that subjectivity,
Yes.
that perfect is in the eye of the beholder. There's not like one standard of perfect. And so it's like when you're going to the nth degree to like move this and do this and have this element of the project, it's your own version of perfect. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's the best it can be.
Yeah. And like, or it's, yeah, the best it can be in the eyes of 5 different people, right? Like,
Right.
and it's such, yeah, no, I agree. I think that's, and I think folks have alluded to that before, that like in some of the other voice notes that, yeah, it's not like we're kids and we're given like, this is what it means to be perfect. Here are these 10 things, in which case I would nail all of them. I love following rules and checking boxes. But yeah, it's not. We don't have like a set of standards, and they change, and culturally it's different, and generationally it's different, and for so many ways it can be different. And I think that's one of those things that I can like use to try and remind myself to like chill out a little bit, because like getting this to what I've defined as perfect actually may not be what people want. It may not be a good use of my or their time to try and get it to that point.
I love that point that you also brought up earlier, is that like they may have a totally different vision for what this thing is. And so like do the 80% and then get some feedback and adjust and whatever. But I think it's like goes back to, okay, fine. If you're in elementary school and you're taking a math test, there's a right answer and a wrong answer. But when you're working on a brand campaign or creating a podcast or creating a business strategy, there's no right or wrong answer. It's not a black and white, yes or no kind of situation. And so I think we maybe carry some of that, like there's a right way to do this, into work where there's no right way to do it.
Yeah, it's a wild thing that we like train people up basically in this like very clear cut right or wrong like system, and then put them out in a world where like, I mean, I feel like you've seen a lot of job descriptions, right? Able to deal with ambiguity well, right? But in a lot of cases, we weren't taught how to do that. We were given very clear instructions and really clear expectations for what we were supposed to do with those instructions.
Yeah. Yeah. We were not educated in a way that was like, express yourself and explore options. And
There's more than one right answer. Yeah.
yeah, totally. Totally. I think the inner critic is something that I think is important. And like, am I good enough? Am I doing enough? Did I do that well? I think that comes up a lot in perfectionism. And I think I guess I would say like the flagship Enneagram type for perfectionism is type 1, which is called the reformer. And it's all about, being good, being a good person, rightness, correctness, the right way to do things, a process. And it's like, everything can be better. It's like almost having these ideal standards of the world and like needing to meet them. the world can be a better place. This process can be better. This system can be more efficient. And so there's like a real value in seeing how things could be better. And yet perfectionism becomes such a negative. It's like perfectionism isn't about seeing how things could be greater. It's about seeing why they're not great. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, even like the word that they use to like exacting standards, right? Like that isn't necessarily even like, doesn't necessarily mean the best result. You know, it is this like, it's like this very precise, clinical almost, or maybe formulaic. And again, everyone's is different, but like you have a really strong sense probably in your own head of what perfect looks like. I mean, you're trying to work towards, but it isn't taking actually everything, like other people's perspectives into account. But I also have to say, anytime we talk about Enneagram stuff and you describe a type, I'm always like, yes, that's me. I love efficiency. How can we make this process better?
Yeah, totally. You're every woman. That's just, it's fine. Yeah, I think it does become how do I pick something apart versus how do I imagine something better with some grace, right? And I think it can be both of those things. I think it depends on like the state of mind we're in and maybe how much sleep we got last night. Sure. Did we have a snack today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was deeply irritable earlier, and I think it was just because I was hungry.
Exactly. Most arguments can be solved by giving someone a snack, I think, for sure. Yeah. The other thing that came up, and this was like 2 voice notes ago when she was talking about in the workplace, something that I thought about was like prioritizing and delegating and how perfectionism is like the enemy of those things. And yet our workplaces are like constantly like, you have to prioritize, like you're not going to do everything. Can you do lower priorities at a 50%, or delegate these things that maybe you feel like you could do better than someone else, but do you need to do them just because you can do them well? It's like, does it require you to do it?
I have a friend, Becky Mullenkamp. She has a great podcast too called Feminist Founders. And she talks a lot about this for folks that are kind of in our roles, right? Like more kind of solopreneurs, people own their own business, maybe starting to manage people, starting to like build out even just a small business and like trying to help people get back to their like zone of genius and like helping them let go of these like other pieces that like I can do every part of my business I can do to a very high level. That is true. But like whether it's like leaning on the skills that I enjoy or the actual place where I can add like uniquely better value is like a question that I think we have to ask ourselves as sort of like more independent consultants. And I think for many of us, not everyone, part of the decision to leave the corporate world was to kind of for me, I was like, I don't really want to be managing like 5 or 6 people. It stresses me out and I don't know if I can do it well and I'm not great at delegating. So if I can just do all the things, like a lot of those tendencies of like recognizing what I wasn't good at potentially and likely related to being a perfectionist can just manifest themselves, right? As even in my case, I'm just working with a couple of subcontractors, but I like still want them to have a positive experience in the work. And I want us to create good work together and I want us to have good impact with our clients. And so, it's, I don't know, constant reforming and like learning and unlearning process.
Yeah, totally. Okay. We have one more voice note. So I'm going to play number 5.
Perfectionism shows up in my life in multiple ways. One of those ways being that for example, right now, my kid is in the background watching a movie while I'm recording this voice memo. But, this voice memo is not going to be perfect because there is going to be a kid watching a movie in the background. But that aside, perfection shows up for me when it comes to creativity and art and the vulnerability that comes with that. So, with doing any kind of art form for me, it's a very vulnerable place because it's often how I process my inner and outer world. And to share that and open my vulnerability and expression to scrutiny leads to perfectionism for me, because I want to put out something that is perfect. So that way, when the scrutiny comes, which it always does, that like I can hopefully handle that, because I'm vulnerable and putting myself into the work that I am producing or the art that I'm sharing.
This kind of goes back to the fear of failure. I hear it as the fear of being judged, right? Which I think I relate to a lot. For a long time before I had the podcast, I would like spend so much time like writing a LinkedIn post and then like, okay, well, if I'm going to talk about culture, then I need to know everything there is ever about culture and know every single book that's ever been written about culture, because if I say something and it's wrong, people are going to think that I'm incompetent, or they're going to judge me, or they're going to think like, who does she think she is? And it's like, I would notice that would hold me back so often from putting something out into the world, because it wasn't quote unquote perfect. And like, it's never gonna be. Like, I could read a culture book a day for the rest of my life and probably barely scratch the surface. Like, unrealistic standards, like talk about like I need to be an expert in everything that I ever talk about. Like, that's silly.
Yeah, and I think there's so much it is like putting yourself out there creatively is such like a vulnerable thing. But I do think there is I I think there's a real value in people seeing like curiosity and imperfection in a lot of that. And I actually think one of my like, I don't really do like New Year's resolutions, but I think one of my goals for the year was to like, I don't know, piss off more people. Like,
Yeah.
because of that kind of people pleasing and that perfectionist nature, that like, I worry that if I'm not upsetting some people, then am I saying anything that's like worth sharing? Like, if people aren't really reacting to it, then it's probably really like a really vanilla point of view that like we all maybe agree on, that like, I don't know, the sky's blue, though I'm sure someone wants to debate that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Probably.
yeah, so it's like really like, I think for me, I'm trying to recognize there's really value in that imperfection too, especially in creative endeavors where other people can see and consume that, because I think it helps give others permission to express not perfectly framed arguments. Or I will write a lot on my like sort of personal blog about like questions that I have or like things that are brought up, and I don't have the solutions for it. I don't have a
Yeah.
list of 8 tips on how to address this thing. I just have, this was my experience, and like here's how I handled it, and like here are some other things I thought about doing, and it is what it is. And like even last week I wanted for my like fertility Substack to highlight sort of kind of the disparities with Black women going through fertility treatments. That was sort of, I wanted to spend some of my kind of time off, I have in quotes because I'm a consultant, but like for Juneteenth as a very, very white lady, learning and understanding something that I don't know a lot about, especially as I've been kind of deep diving into kind of fertility trends. And, I definitely put that out being like, I spent today researching this. Like, I've checked my sources. They're .orgs, they're CDC. Like these are reliable sources, but I could get something wrong. But like, what's important to me is that like, we recognize there are disparities in this. We're talking about them. And I'm like starting a conversation about what addressing these disparities could look like. And I don't know if, Arden 10 years ago would have felt comfortable doing that, because I would have been so worried about upsetting someone or someone not understanding my intentions.
Yeah, totally. It can lead us to either like have a lot of anxiety about what we put out in the world, or like procrastinate, right, on putting it out, period. Never put it out. And what what they talked about in the voice note was so interesting to me because it's art and
right.
artistry and creativity. And inherently, art can't be perfect. Like, it's subjective, right? And it's like, what is perfect? Like, there's always going to be someone who likes it and someone who doesn't, and someone who's an expert that thinks this of it, and someone who knows nothing that thinks that of it. And so it's such an interesting and difficult thing to tackle when it's like super personal or subjective, like art.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I was like, I don't think that I don't know if there are really levels of subjective, but I'm like, art is even more subjective than what's perfect to me. Like,
right. And I think part of what I heard in that was that it is her art is very personal to her, which I obviously, you know?
yeah,
And so when someone judges it, it hits really close to home. And I think that's something that I really relate to in terms of like things that I would put out, even though they're for my business. It's like my business is me these days. Very different than if I were working for a company and I was putting something out into the world that like I feel like I could get some distance between that work product and my self-worth. But when it's something so personal, it can feel very, 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 very like high stakes, or that it reflects on you as a human if people don't like it. And I think that's part of why I'm such a perfectionist when it comes to podcast material, like the content that we put out for it, you know?
Yeah. Well, and I think like care about being perfect in different ways, right? That like just how like talking about like perception and how people perceive us, that like there are things that like I am really concerned and diligent about how I appear in some ways, whereas other things I feel like loosey goosey, think what you want, right? But if it's like tied to my like value or like identity, that's when I maybe like am kind of overthinking and spending too much time trying to make something perfect, because I don't want people to misinterpret my intention or what my values are, what's really like important to me. And so I think I would assume, right, that like sort of this podcast is sort of really interlocked with like kind of part of your identity or your values and what you're trying to do, and it's about more than just like this audio sounds good.
Exactly. It's 100%. It's like part of what I want to create and a message that I want to send, and you know, how I want to grow my business and all of those things. So yeah. So what else do you want to say about perfectionism? And what resources do you think might be helpful for somebody who wants to balance this kind of high standards, the drive to make everything perfect?
I mean, I think with so many of these kind of labels, especially those that we've been carrying around for, you know, most of our lives, it just requires like some uncomfortable practice, right? And so it's like sending off for me, like it's like sending off the draft of that blog post when I think it's 90% there, and being like, and if it's the first, especially if it's the first thing I'm saying, like, here's a first draft, want your reactions. Sometimes there's a couple edits and we publish it, right? Like, you know, it's almost like questioning yourself on like, is this like getting this 10% better actually a good use of my time? And I think depending on your relationship with whoever's at the other end of this thing that you're trying to do perfectly, you can kind of communicate what those kind of concerns are or sort of what feedback you're looking for. But, you know, I feel like it comes up a lot with people that are trying to like get over being a perfectionist, this idea of like your 90% is someone else's 110. And I think that may be true in some cases, but I think almost the way that we've been thinking about the subjective nature is like your 90% is someone else's like oranges, right? Like it's just like not even on the same scale. And so like you have to get other people's, because it's so objective, you've got to bring other people into setting kind of what those standards are for what perfect or really good or, you know, good enough to publish looks like.
Yeah, I think that's so important. To me, one of the things that was said in one of the voice notes was this idea of self-compassion. And when we are so focused on perfection, we leave no room for self-compassion. And building this muscle, right? Like you said, this kind of uncomfortable practice, it's like we have to do it. I think we can understand maybe what might be beneath the compulsion to like do steps 25 through 29 when you really only needed 14 steps. I think if we can, do some reflection around like, what does it mean to be perfect? Why is that important? When has it maybe been something that I need to do in my life and maybe I don't need to do it anymore?
Yeah.
I think that can be an important thing. And then like building a practice of self-compassion, which there are many, many ways to do it, small ways, big ways, but there's a great website called centerformsc.org that has a bunch of self-compassion practices. You can start to build a practice. You could take like
I love that.
a quick self-compassion break and like have that be a tool that you always have in your back pocket wherever you are when you need just to pause and remember that like humans are not perfect.
Yeah, this sounds like a resource I should check out.
The other thing, and this came up when you were talking about how much time you're putting into things, right? It's like, I think, there's this concept of if you explore, like, what are your values, right? What means the most to you in the world? And that could be people or it could be things you value. It could be, the wheel of life that has like 8 different buckets, right? Health and wealth and career and family, whatever. So if we think about the buckets of things that are important to us in our life, and then we look at our calendar, like how closely do those two align in terms of how we're spending our time? And I think that's like a really maybe rude awakening for the perfectionists out there who are looking to kind of take a step back, is like, how much time are you spending doing these things, and what are those taking time away from?
Yeah, and I think too, it's a little bit, I think, related to self-compassion, but in a like it's sort of the opposite of like getting other people's input on what perfect is, but also just like we talked about like kind of pride and like our own work, that like I just finished a 30-page research report with a co-writer, and it's off now for feedback with a bunch of people that I'm sure are going to have a lot of opinions on it. And I tried to take a moment with her too, where I was like, this is really amazing. Like, I don't know what's going to happen to it from here. And it may be really annoying if we have to change a lot of things, but I'm really proud of what we put together. And I think this is really good. And just like taking a moment for that and knowing that anything could happen after that point. But I that's what I've been trying to like. I think it's so easy, even with our own like art or creative intentions, like creative practices, we're, putting things out in the world. We're putting them on Instagram, on LinkedIn, and we're getting likes or people are commenting on it and we're looking for engagement or clicks or whatever. And it's really easy to like put all of our sort of like validation on a job well done on other people. And I think letting ourselves enjoy and relish in the good work that we've done, and whether we feel proud of the art that we've done and whether it feels reflective of us is important too.
Yeah. And that's a great note to end on. So we will be back with more episodes of more labels, but we're not going to do it perfectly.
We're not. I promise.
But feel free to share your thoughts. I would love to hear anyone listening to this.
We love feedback.
Perfectionism shows up for them, and exactly, and how we can get better.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.